The Adventures of a Newcomer, continuation of Chapter 20. Before noon he had sold $3 worth of his goods. By this time the village youth had discovered him. They rallied together, 12 or 15, and in simplicity of their heavy coats, coarse caps, and woolen mittens began to pass invidious remarks upon Ethelrod's more complex attire. "We've just come out of a bandbox," said one. "Just look at the latest style." "Say, are you a boy or a girl?" inquired the third. Ethelrod flushed. "Go away, please," he said. "There's a fellow here your size. Would like to lick you," suggested the other pleasantly, and he put his hand upon a sturdy, tanned lad, no taller than Ethelrod, but much stouter. "I'll do it with one hand tied behind my back," asserted this young man. "Here, you, Tommy Taggart, go home now, or I'll tell your mother on you. Go away from here, all you boys, do you hear?" The woman who thus interrupted the openings of hostilities was standing on the threshold of her house. Judging by her face and manner, she was of more than ordinary consequence in Collinsville. Tommy was the first to take his leave, and the others, not slow to follow, left Ethelrod facing Mrs. Rainey. "Thank you, ma'am," said Ethelrod, removing his hat. "What are you doing here, little boy?" continued Mrs. Rainey. "I'm trying to sell all sorts of things, ma'am. I'm a peddler." The lady cast a longing look upon the bright face before her and sighed. She had no child to gladden her home. "It's a pity to see a little fellow like you at such work. You ought to be at school, my dear." "I have been to school, ma'am, a good deal." "I thought so. Your manners are not what one would expect of a person of your calling. Where did you go to school?" "Please, mayn't I show you some of my wares?" Ethelrod, in thus changing the subject, advanced that he did not wish to enter into the question of his past life. "Yes, child, come inside. It is cold. Don't you feel the weather?" "My toes do, ma'am," returned the lad. "Thank you. I shall come in gladly." Mrs. Rainey, who was the wife of the village banker, made several purchases. "And now, my boy, won't you take dinner with me? I never asked a peddler to dinner before, but you are a little boy, and a good boy, and I can see behind it all a dear loving mother." Here Ethelrod, as he thought of his mother and of his ungrateful part from her, of his wayward conduct, could contain his emotions no longer and burst into a fit of weeping. "There, there, my dear," said Mrs. Rainey, leaving the doorway, advancing to the gate and patting the boy on the head. "I see there is something sad in your past life, and I won't ask you anything more about it." "Thank you, ma'am," said Ethelrod. "There is something sad, and not the way you think. I'm obliged to you for not asking me to explain, but I shall explain to you by letter in a few days. I am ashamed to now." Had Ethelrod then and there told what he knew, as he felt prompted to do, he would have been spared much suffering, but shame held him silent. Even had he then and there resolved to bring to an end at once his career as a peddler, all might have gone well with him. But he had promised to do Packy's work faithfully, and he clung to his resolution. Accordingly, after a hearty dinner and a pleasant chat with Mrs. Rainey, Ethelrod, with profuse and sincere thanks, took up his pack and bade her farewell. "So you are going to Hagertown, my dear? You know the way, I suppose. I've got a map of the road which I'm to take in my pocket, ma'am. This road past your house is the main road, isn't it?" "Yes, my dear. You go along this for a full 2 miles and a half before you turn. Good-bye." The kind lady, in motherly fashion, kissed the little lad and said, "Don't forget to write to me and to tell me your name and all about yourself. You have given me a very bright hour. God has shown his benefits upon me. A good husband, true friends, and education means, but my dear, the little boy of mine, who should be about your age, lies over there." And she pointed over towards the graveyard, which she did not see, for her eyes were dimmed with tears. Ethelrod departed, thinking of his fond mother. Oh, how he had wished he could recall that hour of parting and that silly conspiracy on board the train. Ethelrod was resolved henceforth to be a different boy in his dealings with his mother. Half an hour's walk told upon him. He had been upon his feet for several hours of the morning, and the pack was heavy. Moreover, he was unaccustomed to this manner of life. Worst of all, it was growing cold, and the wind from the north made every step a struggle. He was a very tired and a very sad and a very repentant boy before he came to the first turn in the road, and now the question was which direction to take. He laid down his pack and felt in his pocket for the rude map. It was gone. Then little Ethelrod cried heartily, after the fashion of mamma's darlings in such circumstances. His feet were aching with the cold, his hands were benumbed, and there was a strange feeling about his ears. Not a sharp, but a dull, dead pain. He looked about him. There was not a house in sight, and to crown all, darkness was coming on apiece over the dull, dead fields, and the naked trees through the branches of which the bitter wind howled in desolation. It was getting colder every moment, and inexperienced as he was, Ethelrod recognized the danger of resting in such an exposure. He arose with a heavy heart, and trusting to luck, turned to the right. And very soon, so weary and footsore had he become, he abandoned all hope of reaching Hagertown that night. In the distance he saw a light shining. It was probably a farmhouse. If he could only reach that light. On he trudged with failing steps. The dull pain from the cold had grown duller, and this cheered him. Had he but known what this change meant, he would have been frightened. The boy was in danger of freezing to death. At length, after one of the weariest, longest quarters of an hour in his life, he came opposite the light. It shone from a large homestead back some 50 feet from the roadside fence. With little difficulty Ethelrod found the gate and was feeling for the latch, when a low growl brought his heart to his mouth, and a large mastiff came bounding towards him. Ethelrod stood in great fear of dogs, many of who are not mamma's darlings share the same dread. He turned and ran back the way he had come, ran till his legs refused to do their duty, ran, promised to be disastrous in its consequence. He felt as if he were about to faint. Even the cold ground seemed to invite him. He thought of his mother, but he did not cry. It was a time to act, and to act quickly. Unfastening the pack, he threw it upon the road, and, summoning all his strength, he made on, determined to reach Mrs. Rainey's house, which stood at the outskirts of the village. Thus, relieved by the abandonment of Packy, Jarbone's pack, for a few minutes he advanced with new energy, and he congratulated himself that the pain had all gone. But how drowsy he was getting! He felt that he could sleep for 24 hours at a stretch. More than once he was on the point of throwing himself upon the wayside, but some blind instinct withheld him from indulging in a sleep which would, in all likelihood, have known no waking. At length he reached the main road and turned oh so wearily towards Mrs. Rainey's. In the distance he saw another light. It was near. It was moving. Nearer and nearer it came, while upon the still air there fell the sound of falling hoofs and moving wheels. "Help!" called Ethelrod. A lantern flashed about from the buggy and moved about rapidly till it rested upon Ethelrod. "Are you the boy that was at Mrs. Rainey's?" "Yes, let me in. I want to sleep." The gentleman jumped from the buggy, ran up to Ethelrod, and as he threw the light upon his face, noticed how white and his extremities had become, and he exclaimed, "My goodness, just in time. The boy is freezing to death." Ethelrod did not hear this. He had fallen into the man's arms. Quickly conveying him to the buggy, the man forced some liquor down his throat, wrapped him carefully in a large buffalo robe, and turning round, touched his horse with the whip. The animal was a blooded horse. He sprang forward with all speed, as though he realized he were racing against death. "Go on, Prince, go on," cried the driver. "Go on, old boy. It's up to you." In little more than 4 minutes they drew up to Mrs. Rainey's. Even as they paused, the good woman threw open the door. "Did you find him?" she cried. "Yes, wife. Your presentiment was correct. It was just in time to catch the boy before he was frozen." As Mr. Rainey spoke, he came hurrying across the lawn with the boy bundled as he was in the robe. "Here, my dear, take him in and change while I go off again for the doctor. I shall be back in 10 minutes. It was an anxious hour that followed, but thanks to care and love and sacrifice and prompt medical treatment, the boy was soon pronounced out of danger. In the evening paper of the following day there was published this time of the news. "Adventure of a peddler. He didn't know the way, and the day was cold." It was this cheap bit of newspaper wit that caused Packy Jarbo such surprise at the railroad station on the night of his first attempt at running away. On the instant he changed his plans, he would return to the college and spend a few more days in the hope of fleecing some of the students. The danger of detection was great, but Packy did not mind taking a risk. Before returning to the college, Packy scribbled a note to his uncle, the hotel keeper, in which, without disclosing fully the state of his affairs, he entreated him to send him a health bulletin every day concerning the boy who lay sick at Mrs. Rainey's house. The answers were to be forwarded to Master Packy Jarbo, Henryton, P.O. Packy next made a confederate and mail carrier of the day scholar Farewell, and thus succeeded in keeping informed of Ethelrod's movements. The following letter was the last which he received. Tuesday, January 31st, 1890. Dear Nephew, the boy is getting round quite smart and will leave Rainey's next Wednesday. They say he is going to a school. He is not a peddler. I seen him today. He was sitting in a window and looking tolerable. Why are you so anxious about his health? Your loving uncle, Calvin Jarbo. Packy had anticipated the news contained in this note and was prepared, when he received it, to run away at an hour's notice. He took to flight accordingly after studies on the same evening, with what result the reader already knows. Chapter 21, in which Ethelrod finds the best of mothers. "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Rainey on Thursday morning, "we shall have to lose you." "No, it is I who am going to lose you, ma'am," said little Ethelrod, who, seated at the breakfast table, was eating with the appetite which youth and convalescence are wont to develop. "Only for your kindness, I don't know what would have happened to me." "I took your mother's place, dear," said Mrs. Rainey simply. "When you told me your story yesterday, I was so relieved. So long as I did not know the true circumstances of the case, it pained me to think that you were to take up that wretched peddler's life again." "That's over," said Ethelrod. "I've been taught a lesson. When Mamma comes back, I think she will find me a different boy. I felt awful sorry for my conduct towards her after I left you that day and began to freeze on the road. Then, ma'am, since I've been with you, I've learned a lot. One of the reasons I had for going off as a peddler was because Henryton College was a Catholic school. The people around our place are all bitter against Catholics, and I believe everything I heard. No one can blame you for that, Ethelrod. You were the first Catholic I ever met, Mrs. Rainey, and when I came to myself in your house and saw a crucifix over the bed I was on, a picture of the Virgin, I saw your kind face bending down over me too, and there were tears of joy in your eyes, because I had come to myself, and then I felt that there couldn't be anything so bad about Catholics, and you were just like my mother, the way you treated me." Mrs. Rainey's face grew very tender as she listened. "And sometimes," continued the eloquent lad, "when you thought I was asleep, I wasn't, and I used to watch you saying prayers on your beads." I like to look at your face then, and it used to look something like the beautiful face of the Virgin in the picture. No, I'm in earnest, said Ethelrod to Mrs. Rainey, and now I shall always be glad to see a crucifix or a picture of the Virgin, for they will make me remember your kindness. Mrs. Rainey kissed the little boy, but said nothing. I am ashamed to write to Mamma about my conduct, Mrs. Rainey, and I hope you'll do it for me. I know you will put it kindly, and don't forget to tell her how sorry I am. I shall write to her this day, Ethelrod, and will tell her that you are now well and about to go to college, and that you go there with a strong intention of doing well. Thank you, ma'am. In a day or so, when I get settled down at Henryton, I will write to her myself and tell her of your kindness, and I will tell her, too, that I intend wearing that miraculous medal you gave me around my neck till I die. With regard to the miraculous medal, a word of explanation should be given. An hour or two after Ethelrod's departure from her home, Mrs. Rainey, as was her custom, said some short prayers to the Blessed Virgin Mary, concluding with a petition for the safety of the little peddler. She kissed her medal at the end, and even as she did so, it was borne upon her that the boy peddler was in danger. Mrs. Rainey went over to the window and threw it open. It was a biting breeze that blew upon her. She had not thought it so cold. How could a child such as he bear exposure to such a temperature? Mrs. Rainey took out her beads and said them earnestly for the little wanderer, whose pretty ways and childlike innocence had won her heart. She was finishing the last decade when the sound of wheels without brought her breathless to the gate. "Don't get out yet, James," she said to her husband. "There's a little boy peddler gone down the road to Hagertown, and I feel sure that he's in danger. He's no ordinary peddler, and there is something mysterious about him. He looks as if he could not stand such exposure. It may be my imagination, but I shall not rest tonight unless I know what has happened to him." He was on his way to Jarbo's hotel. "Won't you please? Oh, but you must be cold. Here, let me go. It's a short drive." "I'm not that kind of man, Martha. Cold, why, I feel as comfortable as a polar bear. You may be mistaken, but mistake or not, it's a charitable and a kind impulse. Get up there, Prince. I say, Martha," he added, as the horse turned, "have a warm supper ready, and goodbye." And when Mr. Rainey returned with the poor boy, one of the first things Mrs. Rainey did was to put her miraculous medal on the chest of the sufferer and commission his recovery to the office of the Immaculate Queen. All of this she had told Ethelrod with her usual simplicity, and Ethelrod, looking at her, had said, "Mamma is one, and you are two, and she," holding up the medal, "is three, and I have three mothers now." Mrs. Rainey accompanied Ethelrod to the Henryton College. She told her beautiful story to the president, and had she really been Ethelrod's own mother, she could not have pleaded more effectually for the runaway. The boy was received unconditionally. The last chapter. "What a happy crowd!" exclaimed Father Noland as he entered the boys' refectory on the morning of the first Friday in February. "Come here, Father, come here. Sit near me. This is the best place." The eager young voices produced a babble of welcome, while the good old father stood smiling and undecided. Earl, the first communicant, sat at the head of the table. The loveliness of his soul seemed to shine forth from his noble face. To his right, scarcely less happy, sat little Ethelrod, and to his left that giddy young godfather, Eddie Devereux, who could not sit still for very joy, but kept bobbing up and down like a jack-in-the-box. Roger Haynes and Peter Lane were there too, and waiting upon the breakfast party were the vice president and the venerable treasurer of the college. "It's all like a story out of the book, Father Noland," cried Eddie Devereux, who had leapt up, and catching the father's cincture, gently forced him to place nearest Earl. We thought we had a lot of adventures here, but the real Ethelred Preston story beat us all. There was some sort of providence in the whole matter, said Earl gravely. I couldn't help thinking of this morning after communion. Just 1 week ago I was determined never to become a Catholic. I was angry and spiteful, and I really thought that I should never change. And do you know, Ethelred, that if you had arrived that day, as you should have arrived, I believe that I should have stuck to my resolution. Little Ethelred stopped eating to put on the look of astonishment. You see, you're a nice fellow, and you have a good home training. There isn't a boy in the yard that is better off in the respect than you. Most of us, in judging others, go a great deal by manners, and I'd have compared you with the average Catholic boys here, which would not have been their advantage, and you would have helped to confirm me in my notion of sticking to Protestantism. You are going to be an analyst, Earl, said Father Noland. What you say is quite true. Most of us judge by the exterior and outward respectably. It is often taken for morality and religion, and perhaps for that very reason it was the false Ethelred that threw cold water on my resolution. So then the boy you call Mamma's darling converted you? Observed Ethelred. He certainly had a great deal to do with it. Which shows, put in Father Noland, in what wondrous ways God brings about his holy will. So Mamma's darling, by going here, did a heap of good without knowing it, said Roger. And just think of all the fun he afforded us, chimed in Devereux. In fact, he has done good to almost every one except himself, said Earl. What a pity he didn't get some improvement out of the adventure. Perhaps he has, my boy, said Father Noland. The boy's dishonest schemes all went wrong. That may be a lesson. Again, he has been in good company for a week, and no one but God knows how much hidden good is done by good example. You yourself, Earl, were very kind to him, and I cannot think that all your kindness has gone for nothing. Let us hope that the boy may be better and wiser for his adventure and misadventures at Henryton College. I feel bound to pray for him, without intending it. He did me a great deal of good, said Earl. And you, Ethelred, what have you to say for yourself? Asked Father Noland. I can't say all I'd like and eat by breakfast, sir. These biscuits are better than our cook's. But it seems to me that if I had come to college that day, I should have come. I'd have been chock full of ugliness. I hated Catholics, and I was angry at Mamma, and I wouldn't have studied. I did wrong by going off peddling, but God punished me. He nearly froze my ears off. When God is particularly good, he punishes us swiftly, observed Father Harter. When the punishment comes tripping upon the heels of the fault, we see the connection, and we repent. That's the way it was with me, sir. The night I was freezing, I prayed in earnest, and I think God heard me. And then it looks as if the Virgin helped to save me. And then I was treated so nicely at Mrs. Rainey's. It knocked the bottom out of all my prejudice. Talks like a book, doesn't he? Whispered Eddie to Roger. Well, Ethelred, said Earl, with his kind, winning smile, there's more than that coming to you from your adventure. What else, Earl? I'm thinking of that medal upon your chest. It is going to convert your mamma, and you too, some of these days. Ethelred turned his eyes down and blushed. Earl had touched the wish which Mrs. Rainey, by her goodness, had inspired, and which the company now about him had strengthened his mother. Be it remembered, left him to choose his own religion. And within a year, all who were present at the first communion breakfast recalled the remark and wondered, in the light of its coming true, whether it had been a prediction or a prophecy. The end. I hope you have enjoyed this book. And it was written by Father Finn, and I'll read a little bit about his life. He wrote quite a few books that you can find and read. About the author, the son of Irish immigrant parents, Francis J. Finn, S.J., was born on October 4th, 1859 in St. Louis, Missouri. There he grew up attending parochial school. As a boy, Francis was deeply impressed with the Cardinal Wiseman's famous novel of the early Christian martyrs, Fabiola. After that, religion really began to mean something to him. 11-year-old Francis was a voracious reader. He read the books of Charles Dickens, devouring Nicholas Nickleby and the Pickwick Papers. From his first communion at age 12, Francis began to desire to become a Jesuit priest. But then his fervor cooled, his grades dropped, and his vocation might have been lost except for Father Charles Choppins. Mr. Choppins urged Francis to apply himself to his Latin, to improve it by using an all-Latin prayer book, and to read good Catholic books. Father Finn credited the saving of his vocation to this advice and to his membership in the Sodality of Our Lady. Francis began his Jesuit novitiate and seminary studies on March 24, 1879, as a young Jesuit scholastic. He suffered from repeated bouts of sickness. He would be sent home to recover, would return in robust health, and then would come down with another ailment. Normally, this would have been seen as a sign that he did not have a vocation, yet his superiors kept him on. Father Finn commented, "God often uses instruments most unfit to do his work." During his seminary days, Mr. Finn was assigned as prefect of St. Mary's boarding school or college in St. Mary's, Kansas, which became the fictional St. Maur's, where he learned, often the hard way, how to teach and discipline boys. One afternoon, while supervising a class who were busy writing a composition, Father Finn thought of how they represented to him the typical American Catholic boy. With nothing else to do, he took up his pencil and paper. Why not write about such boys as are before me? He asked himself. In no time at all, he had dashed off the first chapters of Tom Playfair. When he had read it aloud to the class, they loved it. Of course, they wanted more. Francis was finally ordained to the priesthood around 1891. This was the year that Tom Playfair was published. Father Finn's publisher, Benzinger Brothers, was to call Tom Playfair the most successful book for boys and girls ever published in the English language. Father Finn would write 27 books in all, which would be translated into many as 10 languages, and even into Braille. Father Finn spent many years of his priestly life at St. Xavier's in Cincinnati. There he was well loved, and it is said that wherever he went, if he took a taxi, ate at a restaurant, attended a baseball game, people would not take his money for their services, but instead would press money into his hand for his many charities. Children especially loved him. It is said that at his death in 1928, children by the thousands turned out to mourn their departed friend. It was Father Finn's lifelong conviction that one of the greatest things in the world is to get the right book into the hands of the right boy or girl. No one can indulge in reading to any extent without being largely influenced, for better or for worse. According to the American Catholic Who's Who, Father Finn is universally acknowledged the foremost Catholic writer of fiction for young people. And I'll try and post a picture of Father Finn on Instagram or Facebook. Thanks so much for listening, and next Friday I'm going to start a sea adventure, which I'm excited about. I love sea adventures. So thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.